Welcome to Common Sense Call-In. My name is Earl Wright, and I am the chairman of the board of Common Sense Policy Roundtable. At Common Sense Policy Roundtable, we believe in sound fiscal economic research that is essential to uphold Colorado's economic vitality, assure its future, and individual opportunity. Our mission is to research and promote common sense solutions for economic issues facing Colorado. This is an opportunity for those of you joining to learn more about the economic and policy issues that impact the future of our state. Today, as you may have questions that come up during our conversation, please hit *3, and that will eventually allow us to know you're interested, and we'll bring you in at the end of our session and allow you to ask your question. Today, we'll be taking a sneak peek into our upcoming education study, updating listeners on the latest news related to PERA, which we've all had a lot of conversation about over the last 3 years. And PERA, as you know, is our state's pension fund. Before we begin, a quick reminder to save the date for our next Eggs in the Economy breakfast on September 4th, featuring Colorado Speaker of the House, Casey Becker. And we have our Common Sense Policy Roundtable Education Fellow, Dr. Brenda Dickhoner. CSPR Director of Policy and Research, Chris Brown, will be there. You all know Chris from previous calls. And if you'd like more information or to attend, please RSVP on our website, where you can also find links to our other studies. And I encourage you to look at the other studies, so they're rather broad and we're very relevant, and that's www.commonsensepolicyroundtable.org. Right now your lines are muted, and they will be until the end of the call. Then when we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers, and I said before, if you have a question at that time, please press *3. Joining me today, and let's get started, is Chris Brown, our Director of Policy Research, and Dr. Brenda Bausch Dickhoner, CSP's Education Fellow. Dr. Dickhoner graduated from Duke University with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science, and she earned her Doctor of Philosophy and Public Policy from the University of Colorado, Denver. She spent the last decade working in education policy at the national and state level. Most recently, at the Colorado Department of Education, she developed and implemented policies to ensure all students have access to high-quality education. And hopefully we'll have a little discussion about that today. Highlights of Brenda's work will include helping Colorado's Commissioner and the State of Board Education determine actions to take to improve the state's lowest performing schools and districts. That's what she's done in the past. Welcome to both of you, Chris, Brenda. Thanks for joining us. Brenda, let's get started with you. CSPR has been working hard on a new education study, soon to be released in the next few weeks. Brenda, can you give us, explain a little bit about what the study will contain and the different issues it will cover?
Yes, thank you. This study is focused on K-12 education funding. We take a look at a decade's worth of data to try to understand the nuances of our funding system, and from really both a revenue and expenditure perspective. We also take a look at teacher pay and teacher turnover as well. And those are the main areas that this report will cover.
Well, let's ask a question there if we could. So you're going to look at the funding and the teachers' pay and turnover. Do you expect to find any correlation between funding and teacher pay and turnover? Or do you expect that turnover is going to be at a certain level regardless of pay? What are your expectations?
Yeah, well, we have this report as close to being ready to be released. We do have some of our findings already established, and we found some interesting trends in the teacher data. We have teacher turnover is actually quite reasonable for the profession, and in particular in comparison to other professions. So right now, teacher turnover is at about 17%. That's what it was in 2017. And our study runs from 2007 to 2017, so that's the availability of data that we have right now. And so we have teacher turnover about 17%, The turnover for all other education jobs is 20%. And then if you look at all jobs in Colorado in all sectors, private and public, the turnover is 50%. So
Wow.
really the turnover is, it's actually quite, I would say is lower than what we would expect from the rhetoric we hear that teachers are kind of fleeing the profession as some of the narrative that's out there. And in reality, the data doesn't reflect that.
That's really fascinating. Is there any correlation to pay?
Yeah, so we did look at, and we looked at the data at both a regional level and at a district level within just the metro region to kind of understand those differences that are happening within Metro Denver. And you have districts that are paying teachers very different salaries that are just a few miles down the road from one another. And what we see is there is slight correlation, but really it's all over the place. You could have a district with low turnover who is still paying their teachers not very well, and you have districts that are paying their teachers very high wages and still have high turnover. And what we know from the research is that there are other factors besides salaries that keep teachers at a job. Teachers want a school culture that is stable. They want good leadership. They want to have good collaborative relationships with their peers, and oftentimes that can affect a teacher's decision to stay or not just pay.
That's fascinating. I know in corporate America you'd probably come up with the same answer to some extent, but it sounds to me like maybe that the environment you're talking about, the education environment, may be more relevant in turnover than maybe even in corporate America. You're going to share all that, right, in your study?
We will, yes.
That's interesting. What other areas, related data, have you found that you can share with us?
Yeah, we looked at the funding system, so how school districts and schools in Colorado are receiving dollars, generating revenues, and how they're spending them. And I think one of the big takeaways is that there's a lot of structural problems with the way that we're currently funding our schools. So we're generating revenue, and we're then allocating dollars to schools in a way that's not very equitable. It also just doesn't really make kind of a lot of sense, and there wasn't really a good policy reason behind it. It's just this is sort of the way the system has evolved. And what's happening is you have taxpayers in Pueblo, for example, and that's more of a district that has high levels of poverty. So Pueblo is actually subsidizing schools in Aspen, even though Aspen's a much wealthier area. So that's
hold on.
What happened? Yeah.
Brenda, wait a minute. That doesn't pass the common sense standard here. How is it that Pueblo can end up subsidizing Aspen, and the taxpayer? I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, so the way that the property tax rates have the mill levies for school districts, they got ratcheted down following the passage of Tabor, and then the mill levies were frozen into place in 2007 with legislation. And so different districts had their property taxes reduced in different rates, or at a different rate. And Aspen saw theirs get ratcheted down quite a bit. So their mill levy is pretty low, and it's one of the lowest. And so they do not generate a lot of local revenue through property tax. And the way that our system works is that the state basically backfills whatever a local entity cannot fund. So they look at local revenues first, and then they say, well, we need to get you to this per pupil rate, and so we're going to fill that gap. We're going to backfill that with state dollars. So what's happening is Aspen's getting a lot of state dollars because they're not generating a lot at the local level through property tax. Whereas Pueblo is a higher mill levy, they generate a lot more property tax revenue locally, and they don't actually get much from the state either. But they're still paying income tax, and the income tax that goes into the state pot of money then goes over to Aspen. So you have, in effect, kind of lower income districts that are subsidizing some of our wealthier districts.
Okay. And I guess the question is, and hopefully your study will look at it, is to the students, is there less per dollar student available for education in Pueblo versus Aspen? And I guess you'll take a look at that too?
Yes, we have all of those per pupil dollar amounts available as well.
Okay, that's good. Well, has there been anything else in your study that's kind of surprised you so far?
we've seen that the spending, we looked a little bit at the spending, and we have seen some trends over the last 10 years where salaries, the share of spending spent on salaries has gone down, and you've seen other areas go up. So school districts are now, as a share of their overall budget, spending more on benefits, operations, and administrative functions. The benefit spending we know is going up because of PERA, and there's been these increasing PERA payments to cover especially the unfunded liability. And so you have educators who are, and they're not really getting, more out of the fact that we're paying more to PERA. It's not going to the educators, it's going to cover the unfunded liability. So educators aren't necessarily getting the salary increases they should be getting. They're not really getting more benefits. They're getting squeezed out by sort of these other spending priorities. And there's also, like I said, a little bit more spending on administration and operations as well.
Well, it seems to me, Brenda, that what you're telling us is that if we've increased our spending for education over the past decade or two, that maybe there's a disproportionate amount that has gone to the administration versus the in-classroom expenses and teaching the kids, or am I trying to leap to something that's not likely that you're going to conclude?
Yeah, I think we're going to show the numbers and show the data that we have over time, which does show these trends. And as you said, the more dollars to be spent on other functions that are supporting the classroom but aren't necessarily teacher salaries. I think the larger question then for others to kind of look at our data and then make decisions about is whether or not that's going to help students improve their outcomes. What helps students perform better? Is it paying teachers more, or is it that we have better operational support, more assistant principals, administrative functions, deans of culture? Schools now have deans, more of those kind of administrative positions that support students, but aren't, it's not coming out of the teacher salary line item.
And I just wanted to add a point here. What I've found really interesting in getting feedback from Brenda and collaborating and seeing some of these results, and I think is really one of the primary points of this study. To your questioning, I think there is often a line of questioning that looks at our education system on aggregate as a statewide trend. And I think a purpose of this study was to look by district, by a sub-state geography, to see if those trends actually existed across different geographies and different regions. And it seems like there are some high-level trends, but what we wanted to show was the nuance that certain districts, certain schools have discretion over a lot of these decisions as it relates to pay, as it relates to change in administrative versus in-classroom expenditures, and to highlight that this is not necessarily as broad or as systemic of a problem, and this really comes down to a lot of local decision making that I think gets obscured when we try to just highlight state-level trends.
Well, I know that the timing of this study is something that you all have been pushing for, and I appreciate that, and I think all of us on the call appreciate it. But Chris, I think we're all interested in outcome, and I know you and Brenda are too. So are you going to look at it district by district as to outcomes? So if they have more decision making at the local level, the outcome tends to be better with regards to the proficiency level of the student that graduates, as well as the graduation level. Brenda, do you care to look at that question or answer that question?
Yeah, I'll answer that question. Well, thank you. We're not, in this study, we're showing the trends in spending and revenue and not looking at outcomes yet. I mean, I think that would be a great follow-up study to this report. I think there's been a lot of research that has actually just come out very recently on a national level trying to show more of that link between funding and outcomes. And what some of that national research has shown is that funding does matter, and we know that. We know that we need our schools and our classrooms to have the dollars they need to be successful. I think what we're also finding is that how you spend that money does matter. And so to Chris's point, we could look at that a little bit further to look at especially locally, making those decisions locally and how you want to allocate your dollars, and then trying to see how that's impacting outcomes. And that would be a really good follow-up research question.
It seems to me that you got yourself a position here, Brenda, that there's a lot of follow-on studies to keep you busy.
As long as you keep asking questions.
Well, I'm only asking questions. I know that the folks on the phone call are probably interested, and that's outcome. And what you all have done is you're saying, hey, what are we spending? How are we doing it? And that's the foundation of which you can then ask the other questions. Do I have that right?
I think that's spot on.
Hey,
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay, let's move on if we can for a second. And remember, press *3 at the end of this, and you'll have a chance to ask questions. But let's move on to something else that we have really been focusing on in the past, and that's PERA. And we released a research on this. The 2018 PERA Comprehensive Annual Report was just published in June and highlighted some major areas of concern. I don't think the concerns have gotten any less. Unfortunately, the performance of PERA has not allowed the continuation of the levels that people have received in the past without some adjustments being made. And a lot of people's fears. Poor investment year 2018 occurred. Required contribution amounts of PERA will increase once again. The state has to come up with a raw source of funds. Participants are now starting to feel some of the pain. Okay, Chris, with that positive lead-in, give us some sense of what are some of the debates that are likely to occur and what's likely to evolve out of where we are right now?
Yeah, no, thank you, Earl. It has certainly been a topic of interest for us, and we mentioned it in the previous segment as well as to why it is significant as it relates to education. I have a few follow-up numbers here, but just to remind listeners, this is the state's defined benefit program as opposed to a defined contribution where you would traditionally contribute to a 401k style plan and then draw out the fund as you retire. This is a defined benefit that guarantees a certain level of retirement wage replacing income for working in a public position. So this serves about 500,000 state employees that are either current members, current retirees, or are owed some PERA benefit in the future.
That's 10% of our population.
That's right.
Holy cow.
There's about 120,000 current retirees, and the rest are either current state and local employees, participants. That's right, absolutely. So this is significant, and we can't forget that as part of this discussion. But I think that we wanted to highlight this as part of the conversation today, and we'll do follow-up research as the 2018 annual report just came out recently, showing a poor investment year in 2018. PERA didn't escape the low returns of 2018 , and that due to legislative reform.
Hold on, stop for a second. Poor return is defined as what? What do we have to actuarially receive for this to be a sound financial proposition?
To keep the books balanced,
right.
PERA assumes that they will return, on average, across all their funds, a 7.25% return annually, and in 2018 they had a negative 3.5%.
That's through December or through fiscal year?
Through December.
Whoa.
Calendar year.
Okay. So they got clobbered in December. That's for us in the finance world. That's what happened. Anyway.
So there's obviously some to when you report, undoubtedly, but this in 2018, PERA reform was the center debate, one of the center debates of our state legislature, and they passed reforms that implemented what are known as automatic triggers or automatic adjustments that will occur in the event the funding equation begins to wobble and PERA looks like it will not be able to pay off the unfunded liability or the portion of what is guaranteed versus the funding that they have plus future investments. And so because of these low investment returns, it looks like they have slid off that glide path to pay out the unfunded liability in 30 years.
Okay, I understand all that, but what does it mean? I'm a taxpayer. What does it mean to me when I file my taxes now? Am I all of a sudden going to see is the state going to say, hey, we're poor-boying it, we don't have the money? What does it mean?
Well, not to go back to, but maybe to connect with our education segment here briefly, what it means is that PERA or the state employers, school districts, school administrators are contributing an additional 20.4% of pay that is going to pay down the unfunded liability starting next year.
So less money is going into the teacher's salaries, more is going into the
Precisely. That equates to just over $1 billion just out of our education that is going to strictly pay down the unfunded liability.
Okay.
That's over $15,000 per teacher in our education system that is going, again, just to pay down the cost of past commitments. So as the funding slips, as the contributions increase.
Stop. If you're saying $15,000, if a teacher gets paid $50,000, you're saying 30%?
20.4%.
Oh, 20.4% of every
right.
dollar.
That's right.
Okay. Is that normal? If you're out in industry, would that be normal?
If you're in Illinois or a few other states, it's normal, but it's certainly one of the lowest. PERA is has one of the lowest funded ratios of any public pension in the country. And to your point about the private sector,
so it's underfunded by everybody's participating.
The cost of past commitments has grown well beyond what PERA is able to afford, and the contributions historically were way too low for what the benefit design was.
Okay. So what's the solution? You laugh.
I laugh. Well, I think we spent a lot of time looking at actually making substantive adjustments to improve the funding status, and what we've seen predominantly is more rate and more contribution increases, more money. What we need to
that's already occurring. We got that from
that
the
is
last
occurring.
bill. Okay.
We also saw small reductions in benefits, predominantly on future beneficiaries, our future workforce, our future teachers and public servants. And so we will see what happens, but I think potentially this could have been a line in the sand, and we will see some more discussion around actually reducing the benefit structure, changing the benefit structure to better align with the ability for the fund to make payments.
What's reality here? Let's just get down to the short strokes. Is the reality either you have a reduction in benefits, or does the state come up with more money?
What we've seen is a combination of both.
Well, the state already came up with $225 million, I believe.
That's right.
And it's willing to come up with $250, which was something that came out of the negotiations on the last bill that's passed. So are you telling us to get ready for $250 million from the state to fund this, but you're saying that's not enough, and the current reductions aren't enough, so we're going to go back to the table to figure out how do we reduce more and or come up with more from the state? Is that what you're telling us?
It seems like it could be heading that direction, depending on, again, what the investments continue to look like on an annual basis.
But with that high note, I think we ought to go to questions.
You started off on a high note, so we might as well end on one too.
Okay. We have, remember, press *3 if you have a question. I must tell you, we have my email is going crazy here with questions too. But let's go with our first question, if we would. Please go ahead.
Yes, I'm calling Earl to ask you what your perspective is as a financial advisor on the long-term prospects of PERA, and what happens to the state budget and to Colorado families if nothing further is done.
Well, I can tell you that based upon the best econometric scenario analysis that I've seen, for you to expect a 7.2, 7.5% annualized return in this economic environment with the financial markets where they are, you've got to be pretty optimistic about the U.S. economy and the international economies. And I think more in the financial markets, you see people expecting a 5.5%, 6% annualized return from this point forward. So to hit 7.5%, 7.25%, you've got to be very aggressive. And the only way they can do it is the alternative investments they have. They do have good alternative investments, but they have like 20 or 30% of their portfolio, if I remember correctly, in fixed income, and that's basically an asset that just won't perform that well. So with the composition of financial market instruments that they have fixed in U.S. financial markets, it's going to be very difficult for them to hit 7.5. I hope I'm not being too candid with regards to that. So the answer really has to be, as Chris pointed it out, if you're not going to burden the state taxpayer with more, you've got to change the formula, and it can't be as rich as it currently is with the payout after a short time within public service. You're going to have to extend the public service time to make it work. And if you did that, we did some previous studies, and Chris can talk to that if he wants, that if you added 2 or 3 years onto the retirement age, that has a huge impact with regards to the funding period that you're allowed to catch up in. If you added 5 years, which is more like the standard for the private enterprise, you'd probably solve the issue. I'm a little over my head on that, but I think that's correct. Chris, is that close to being correct?
I think what you've highlighted is that small changes have large effects. And I think, to your point, making those incremental reforms on the benefits, whether it's retirement age, whether it's the portion of the salary that is replaced, what's considered the wage replacement rate, those have large effects, and they're challenging to have reforms politically. But to your point, as we have studied, small changes have substantial effects over the long run. But the longer you wait, the harder it is to catch up.
Yeah, the big one, and I'll go back to it again, is the retirement age. If you extend that, there's a big impact there. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank
Okay,
you.
you're welcome. Brenda, we've got an email question here that comes in. Will any of your studies in the future take a look at the various school districts by socioeconomic background and see what the outcomes of those school districts might be? Because, one of the things that is a cornerstone of the U.S., I'm just building on the email question that came in, is that equal opportunity. And if our education system, regardless of socioeconomic background, doesn't create equal opportunity, I've always gotten the impression that we're not, in essence, saying what our forefathers had intended for us. Are you going to eventually take a look at that issue?
I think so, and thanks for the question. Yeah, it is a very important question, and we know that socioeconomic status is correlated with education performance, but that's not an excuse, because we also know there are school districts that have high poverty levels that are performing well, that are doing well. Their kids have access to higher opportunity or a good high quality education. So the more we can learn from those spots that are working well and how we can apply those to other areas. Right now, all of Colorado's kind of what we would call turnaround districts, the lowest performing districts, do have high levels of poverty in those areas. But again, we can learn from those that have similar populations that are doing well.
But the other question that's interesting came in because somebody obviously is interested in the Denver public school system with this question. Will you be looking at the impact of Denver public school systems adding charter schools and what positive impact, if any, that has had in performance and in the way of proficiency levels as well as graduation rates?
Yeah, that's another great question, and that ties to what I just mentioned about the positive examples out there. Actually, a lot of those are charter schools. So you've seen Denver Public Schools opening up several different charter networks that serve students. They have 80-90% students of color who are low-income students who are having excellent outcomes. They're going to college. They have high test scores. They're having successful lives after graduation. And so having that be proof point of that there is a way to educate all of our students, and what can we learn from some of these charter networks that Denver Public Schools has opened.
Brenda, all I can say is I'm really excited. I know the folks on at least based on the emails I've gotten, and the people I know are going to be excited to see the rest of your studies besides the foundational one you're doing. I don't know that there's any other questions. There's no other questions? We don't have any other questions, and I want to thank everybody for taking the time to come to the conference call. Brenda, it's great to have you on board. It seems to me that we keep expanding the CSPR brain trust here. No offense, Chris, that you're going to have some help now. Anyway, thank you so much, Brenda. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
And for all of you, thank you for participating.
Thank you, Earl.